One of the things I love the most about the home coffee roasting community is the diversity with different types of roasting equipment. Anything from a frying pan all the way up to a full-blown drum roaster is something that people will use. But there's a group of people, and these people are creating ways to roast coffee with some of the most unconventional types of equipment. Some of them are handmade, and others are hacks from some type of appliance or some other means. And so today I want to focus on that, and I've got one that I'm going to do a full roast on here in just a minute. So the question is, why would somebody want to even get involved in a do-it-yourself coffee roaster? Well, one reason is just simply cost. Some of these are very inexpensive to create or to be able to hack and use as a coffee roaster. Let's face it, there's coffee roasters that are very expensive that are out on the market, and some of us either can't afford it or just don't want to spend that type of money in their hobby, and that's completely understandable. So, the money is one factor. Another factor is some people just like to tinker. They're engineer types, or they like the challenge of constructing a simple home appliance that will allow them to roast coffee. And so you have this whole community of do-it-yourself roasters. It's really cool to see some of the crazy ways that people are roasting coffee, and they're roasting great coffee using these methods. Today I've got one that I'm going to share with you, and it is a bread machine. We're going to get into the details of that in just a second, and I'll share with you why I ended up with a bread machine. But first I want to tell you that I've looked at other ways to roast coffee. One was just to simply take an old roaster that wasn't working properly. It was an old Beemore 1600, and I tried to hack that and come up with a way to use a heat gun with the Beemore, and it didn't work. It wasn't successful. And the reason why is because the roasting chamber was too large. Even though I had a drum turning the beans and I had really hot air blowing into the Beemore, I used a heat gun for the Beemore. I tried two different angles of blowing hot air into the Beemore, and I just couldn't get it hot enough. It was just too big of an area. And so this whole topic of do-it-yourself roasters and being able to come up with the means to roast good coffee, it takes a few things. At least in my view, it takes a few things. And one of them is you need to be able to control the roaster. So we need a way to control the heat. We need good bean movement, and so whether it is a drum that's turning or some other means to move the coffee around, we need to be able to do that to prevent scorching and other roasting defects because of the roasting device that we're using, and ultimately manage temperature over time. And so with my various attempts that I've tried, including this Beemore, I ended up using a bread machine. And the reason why I went with the bread machine was, number one, cost. I think my all-in cost on the actual bread machine itself was under $50. I think it was $35 and $15 shipping or something like that on eBay. Here's some pictures of it. You can take a look at it. There's a foot missing or partially cut off on the roaster, so it wobbles a little bit, but ultimately it works. And the thing that I wanted this roaster for was two things. One is the removable roasting chamber, which is basically a metal bucket. And then the other is the size. I really like the size of this bucket because it's small enough to retain the heat, and that's really important. And the third reason why I really like this bread machine is because there is a butter paddle, which basically is a paddle that spins around and allows me to have really good bean movement. And so we're going to see that happen here today. There's several things that I'm going to be using to help me roast coffee today. And the first is ultimately the heat gun. I'll have links for this stuff in the description so you can check it out. Here's the heat gun. This is an Amazon item. This is 1800 watts. It's very powerful. $35 for this heat gun. So we're going to be using the heat gun, and I also have a digital thermometer, and I use this thermometer in some of my other roasts. This is a meat thermometer, and there's an extension that plugs into here, and that wire is going to dangle inside with a probe on the end of it, and so that's going to help me track temperature. And then the third thing that I need are some roasting gloves. We have these hot gloves, and I use these all the time for my fresh roast. I use them for the drum on the Beemore, and I'm going to be using these here today to lift that bucket out to cool the beans. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to be doing is doing a pre-warm. It's important that I pre-warm this roasting chamber to about 300 degrees. So I'm going to have my temperature probe inside of the roasting chamber, got my heat gun turned on to a specific level that I've determined it's not on full, but it's on pretty hot. And the trick to managing temperatures is going to be the distance I have this heat gun from the bean mass. Also, you'll notice during the video when I'm roasting that I'm going to be pointing this in a certain direction away from the bean probe. And so you'll see me doing that here as I'm warming. And it only takes a few minutes to warm this up to 300 degrees. Now, one of the cool things about this bread machine is I'm going to be roasting 400 grams of an Ethiopian coffee. That is quite a bit of coffee. And I'm going to do this in about 10 minutes. That's faster than the Beemore. That's more coffee than I could roast on my Fresh Roast SR 540. And again, my all-in cost for this do-it-yourself roaster is, maybe with the supplies, everything that I showed you here, close to $100. Again, I'll have the links for you to check out everything. You can add it up for yourself and see if this is something that interests you. All right, so let's get started with this, and we'll talk about some of the advantages, some of the disadvantages to using this type of a setup for a do-it-yourself coffee roasting machine. Okay, so I'm charging the roaster with 400 grams of a Ethiopian washed coffee, and we're going to go ahead and we've got the paddle going, the preheat's done, and the beans are in now. And I'm going to be using my iPhone, and this is really interesting. So I'm trying to be as do-it-yourself as possible in this video. And so instead of going online and using a coffee timer or using any sort of software, I'm using my iPhone and I'm using the timer feature. And so when I get to each of my events, I'm going to hit the lap button, and that is going to lock in each of my phase times. So if you've not thought of that, if you haven't done that before, then you use your cell phone. It's got a timer built into it. I'm sure it has a lap feature, and that's what I'm going to be doing here, and you're going to be seeing this appear on the screen. So you've got great bean movement, and you'll see me fiddling around with the probe. Now, I had done, I think, 2 roasts before I have done this roast. I've used this bread machine twice just to do some tests to see if it would actually work. But I've never roasted 400 grams of coffee before. I think the heaviest I did was 300 grams. And I've got 400 grams in it now, and because of the amount, the batch size, my probe is moving more than I thought it would, and so it's starting to kind of spin around a little bit in there. So I'm repositioning it. That will get fixed here. I ended up kind of tucking underneath the handle just so it won't move around as much. Now we see that I am pointing the heat gun into the corner, and I'm going to be focusing on that corner. Because I've got such good bean movement, I am not concerned about having to move the heat gun all around the roasting chamber. Eventually you're going to see me do that. You're going to see me kind of swish around in a circle a couple times, especially later in the roast, and I'll tell you why I do that when we get to that point. So now we can see the beans are changing color. They're starting to lighten up, and we're just a couple minutes into the roast. So that's great progress that I'm really happy to see that moving along, especially with 400 grams. All right, you'll also notice that I've got the thermometer and picture here. I apologize that there's times it got bumped and it got moved, and it is a little blurry, but ultimately, I don't want to focus just on the temperatures. The temperatures are helpful for me for a reference. I'm basically timing my events. So I want to be at dry around 5 minutes. I want to be at first crack probably around 8:30 to 9 minutes. And then I want to be about a minute and a half to a minute in development. I'm going to see how it goes. Okay, so now we're at the 4-minute mark, and you can see the bean movement in here is awesome, and there's already yellowing taking place. The temperature is at like 315, 310 degrees right now at 4 minutes and 22 seconds. I'm starting to move the heat gun around a little bit just to kind of loosen up any chaff and make sure that there aren't any beans that maybe got lodged under the paddle. I didn't notice that, but ultimately I'm pointing at this corner, and I'm about maybe a third of the way into the roasting chamber with the heat gun. It's hard to tell at this angle, but ultimately I'm not putting it right down against the beans. I'm probably about maybe 8 inches away from, maybe 7 inches away from the beans. Okay, here we are at dry at 5 minutes and 1 second, and you can see the lap button was hit, and that's locked in there. We've got full yellow. Now, when I put this into the butter mode, the timer automatically went to 30 minutes, and that's one of the things I really like about this bread machine, is that I don't have to worry about running out of time. I've got 30 minutes to roast this coffee. I'm not concerned about that. Also notice now that the bean probe is behaving, it's staying and it's just touching the bean mass, but it's not all the way at the bottom. So it is in the bean mass, and I'm getting some fairly accurate temperatures, I think, other than I'm sure the heat gun is influencing this somewhat. But we already are past dry, and we were around 320 or 330 degrees. Now we're working our way towards the first crack event, and I want to get to this event around 8:30, as I mentioned, maybe closer to 9 minutes. When I did this video, I really wasn't sure. That was kind of my target. Didn't want to have a long roast. I wanted to get a roast that was between 10 and 11 minutes long. So right now you can see that we've definitely got some really good browning going. You can see some chaff starting to float up. Look around the stainless steel over near the control pad, and you'll notice that there's chaff that's laying there. And it's not going to take too long. When we get close to first crack, you're going to see what happens. Temperatures are rising. We are at 356 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'll put Celsius up on the screen for our Celsius friends. And I'm really excited about this. I've got good control. I'm smelling, very easily smelling what's happening. I've got good visual of the bean color. This is a great way to roast coffee on a budget. At least it is so far. We haven't tasted the coffee yet. Okay, so we are now at 7 minutes. I've got about a minute and a half left. And so you're going to start to see, as we get closer to first crack, more chaff coming out of this roaster. And that's one of the things that is kind of a negative, at least with this setup, is I have no way to collect the chaff. I have no way to do that. Now, I've seen some people use bread machines and use other DIY machines, and they're roasting outside. They're not concerned about where the chaff goes. For me, I'm doing it in my basement. I don't have an exhaust fan, and we're going to get chaff all over the place here. So just be prepared to get chaff all over the place if you're going to use this type of a method. Again, I'm pointing in the same corner. I'm not really moving the heat gun all over the place, and we've got a really good progression. We're at 8 minutes right now, and we've reached 373 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm excited that we're getting really close to first crack, probably within the next 30 to 45 seconds. We'll see how that's marked here. And I'm happy with the progression. All right, so you'll see me swirling the heat gun again. Now I'm trying to start to loosen some of the chaff. I can see it starting to come up, and I want to be sure that I try to get as much of that out of the roasting chamber while the coffee's roasted. We're at 391 degrees on the probe. Some of that could have been the heat gun as I swirled around. Yeah, it's back down to 392 degrees, but we are getting really close to first crack. I'm listening. I hear a crack. And there we go. I've called first crack, and that took place at 8 minutes and 58 seconds, something like that. Now, my goal is to try to get the chaff loosened, and also, let's pay attention to the sound of first crack. Listen to the pace of first crack. It's not out of control. It's consistently cracking, but it's not cracking at a super fast pace. And that gives me a clue of the momentum I have. How fast is my roast moving? And it's roasting and moving at a nice pace, so I'm not really concerned about super, super high temperatures. All right, I'm swirling around the heat gun to try to get as much of that chaff out because I'm going to be dropping this roast here in the next 15 or 20 seconds. And you can just see how much chaff there is. I was actually blowing it off of the top of the bread machine to be able to get that done and get that chaff out of there. And when it's all over with, I just use a vacuum on the counter and then vacuum it all up. It's not a big deal. Okay, we were about ready to drop the coffee. I've stopped using the heat gun. The roasting chamber is hot. I'm taking it right to the cooling tray here on this roaster and getting that coffee as cool as I can. Okay, so now we're going to see what kind of roast level this is. We're going to look at the beans, but first I'm going to weigh the beans to see what kind of moisture loss I had. So we started out at 400 grams of coffee, pouring all of the beans in. We got 353 grams of coffee. When I take the calculator to that, 353 divided by 400, and then we're going to multiply that by 100 and then subtract 100. That is going to give us a moisture loss of 11.75%. That is that's definitely on the lighter side. I would call that a light roast, a light to medium roast. The coffee looks a little dark, at least in this contrast, in this light, but let's get a closer look at it. And there you see it's still definitely got some mottling. You can see here that we've got really no roasting defects. I don't see any tipping. If you look at the beans closely, I don't see any sort of roasting defects. And honestly, for an Ethiopian coffee, the roast color looks pretty consistent for an Ethiopian coffee that's on the lighter side. But, that's my opinion. I've seen more evenly roasted coffee before. But generally speaking, a lot of my Ethiopian coffees tend to be a little uneven in the roast color. Share your thoughts in the comments about what you've experienced with Ethiopian coffees. This is not a dry process. This is a washed coffee, just for reference. All right, several days has passed since this coffee was roasted, and then I tasted the coffee, and I wanted to share my tasting experience with you. Overall, I think it was a successful roast, but tasting the coffee, it was very interesting. It was not like a light, delicate coffee. Even though it's a lighter roast, it was not a florally light, tea-like type experience. It was a very sweet cup. And there was also a really interesting milk chocolate note that almost tasted like a milk dud. It was really a good experience. And I think that if I were to change things up, and it had a nice body to it as well. I think that there was that longer middle phase and the total roast time of over 10 minutes that helped give me some body to the coffee. If I were to do things differently, I think that I would shorten up the browning phase from almost 4 minutes to probably 3.5 minutes, or maybe even a little less if I wanted to try to get a little more acidity. maybe 3 minutes and 20 seconds. And then I would also shorten up the development phase from 1 minute 20 seconds to at the longest 1 minute. And how would I be able to accomplish that unless I hold the heat gun closer? How could I do that? Well, I think instead of 400 grams, I would roast 300 grams of coffee. It would speed things up. I would love to hear your thoughts about what I did with my roast. I'm also interested to hear if you have had experience with a DIY roaster. If you could share what it was, what you did, how you put it together. I'd love to hear that in the comments. I love reading things like that, and I'm sure others would as well. I'll also include a full list of everything that I used in the description. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.